The destruction of the EV market has begun. Joe Biden is shocked as EV sales are crashing hard. He's practically begging the middle class to buy EVs. He's like, EVs are the future, Jack. Why are you abandoning EVs now? But that's not it. The EV market now is so bad that 4,000 auto dealers sent a thrashing letter to Biden, begging him to stop forcing EVs. But why do the political leaders want to force EVs on the common man? Could it be that EVs are a scam? If you thought that our government wants EVs to get cheaper, I'm about to expose a hidden truth that will shock you. So here's what exactly happened. It all began with Biden pushing hard on EV makers. First up, let's talk about the big push towards EVs. You might have heard that President Biden had these ambitious plans to electrify America, right? He's aiming for 50% of new car purchases to be electric by 2030. But here's the thing. The actual sales of EVs are kind of lagging. We're talking about only 4 to 7% of the car market, depending on when you look. Imagine Biden as the coach of a sports team, but instead of athletes, he's got all these car manufacturers. He's not just giving pep talks, he's setting up some serious rules. The Biden administration came out swinging with tough emissions rules that were so hardcore car makers were forced to ramp up their EV game big time just to keep up. We're talking about transforming the entire auto industry here, a complete overhaul from those gas-guzzling machines to sleek green electric cars. Now, the EPA was the villain in this play, proposing regulations that were so strict it's like they were aiming for the moon. Major players in the automotive industry like Ford and Stellantis are worried about the financial penalties they might face under these new standards. Ford is saying it could end up paying $1 billion in penalties, and that's a lot of money that could have been used for other things, like the transition to EVs. And who gets to pay the price for this? Well, of course, the common man. And if this wasn't enough, they've also artificially increased the prices of EVs and specifically told many companies to sell EVs or close shop. But more on that in a minute. Biden wanted that by 2032, up to 67% of new vehicles sold would have to be electric for car makers to stay in the game. That's a massive jump from the current 4 to 7%. EPA Administrator Michael Rean was all about this move. He said these standards would cut down a whopping 3.7 billion tons of CO2. That's like taking the entire U.S. transportation sector's emissions for 4 years and making them disappear. He promised to work closely with everyone involved, labor groups, the auto industry, and green groups to bring this new era of clean cars to life. Now, you might be wondering, how did the public react to all this? Well, it totally backfired. Some people were totally on board, seeing this as a big win for the environment. Others were more skeptical, worried about the cost and whether this shift was doable in the given timeframe. But the thing is, the auto industry was already moving towards electric cars. Giants like Ford and GM were pouring billions into EVs. Ford planned to build 600,000 EVs per year by the end of 2023, and GM aimed for 1 million per year by 2025. These numbers were huge. However, not everyone was moving at the same pace, and some companies were definitely not planning on having 2/3 of their cars be electric by 2032. And that's where the tension started to build. Here's another twist: selling EVs right now is not making money for anyone, well, except Tesla. Other brands are actually losing money on each EV they sell. So dealers are like, if most of our sales are going to be EVs, we're going to be in big trouble. But hey, if you're in the market for an EV, this might just be your lucky day. Dealers are struggling to sell EVs like the Ford Mach-E, which means you could snag it for a good deal. The Biden administration is also facing a lot of pushback on its proposed fuel economy standards. They're getting over 62,939 in the practicality of such a rapid shift to EVs. This is truly turning out to be a battle of government versus the common man, and it's going to be interesting to see who wins. The new rules would mean extra costs for making vehicles around $633 more per vehicle in 2027 and about $1,200 more in 2032. But the EPA argued that drivers would save money in the long run because EVs are cheaper to operate. Plus, there were potential tax credits for car buyers, which would help soften the blow. The big question on everyone's mind was, are these rules actually doable? The EPA insisted they were, pointing to improving technology and government support for EVs. But the auto industry has highlighted the massive challenges ahead. We're talking about not just making more electric cars but building the infrastructure for them, like enough charging stations and mining enough materials for the batteries. Now, imagine you're a car dealer. You've got these EVs sitting on your lot because people aren't buying them as much as expected. But you've already paid for these cars, and now your money's tied up in them. Not a great situation, is it? That's exactly what's happening to a lot of dealers out there. Almost 4,000 of them even wrote to President Biden, asking him to slow down with the EV push. They want things to evolve naturally without forcing it too much. Car companies like GM and Ford have poured billions into developing electric vehicles. But now that these cars are finally ready, they're actually losing money on them. Ford, for example, is reportedly losing $36,000 on each EV sold. That's a huge loss. And it's not just Ford, GM's in a similar boat. They've even had to scale back their plans, like cutting down battery production by 40%. They even shut down production of their best-selling EV pickup, the F-150 Lightning, and slashed their EV sales goals by 40%. One of the biggest issues with EVs is the infrastructure. Most current EV owners charge their cars at home, but what about those people who live in an apartment or don't have a garage? And let's not even start on the lack of public charging stations, especially in rural areas. Range anxiety is real, and it gets worse in cold weather when the battery range drops. Now, let's talk about where EV batteries come from. A lot of the materials needed for these batteries, like lithium and cobalt, are in China. And guess what? China is also the biggest producer of these batteries. So, this reliance on China for key components and batteries puts the US in a tricky spot, especially given the complex relationship between the two countries. EVs are still pretty expensive compared to traditional gas-powered cars. Take the Ford F-150 Lightning, for example. The electric version costs $26,000 more than the base gas model. That's a big chunk of change, and even with the discounts and incentives, EVs are still out of reach for a lot of people. The way car makers have approached EVs is kind of interesting. They're not really designing these cars for the average customer. Instead, they're focusing on luxury, performance, and high-tech features. And that's great and all, but it means these cars are super expensive. It's like they're making EVs for a niche market, not for everyone. So, EV sales are not doing great. They sit longer in dealer lots than gas cars, and with all the pressure from Biden's administration and car manufacturers to sell these EVs, dealers are not happy campers. Their money is stuck in these unsold vehicles, plus the manufacturers themselves are losing big money on every EV sold. When we talk about infrastructure, it's not just about charging stations. The entire electrical grid would need a massive overhaul to handle a huge number of EVs. And then there's the issue of resources for making batteries. Most of these come from China, which holds a significant amount of control over key battery elements. So, here's what you should focus on: the push for EVs is impacting the middle class the most. And why is that? Because the average middle-class consumer can't easily afford these expensive EVs. Plus, there are all these issues like range anxiety and infrastructural challenges that make life more complicated. This isn't just the whole world is moving towards EVs, but the US is struggling to keep up with China in EV technology. Dealers are right to ask Biden to slow down with electrification. Pushing for EVs is making China stronger and the US weaker, especially since China controls most of the resources needed for EV production. EVs are expensive, and that's a big problem. The technology is new and costly, so even though buyers are paying more, car makers are still losing money. So, what's the bottom line here? Most people aren't really on board with EVs just yet, aside from early adopters and high-income households. The average American doesn't see the logic in buying an EV. They're expensive, complicated to live with, and there are infrastructural issues. People are aware of the environmental benefits, but they don't want to bear the burden of the EV transition alone. So, here's the takeaway: the push towards EVs needs to have a balanced approach. We have to consider consumer demand, technological readiness, and economic implications. Until buying an EV makes sense for the average person, the middle class isn't going to embrace them. It's as simple as that. It's not just about buying an eco-friendly car, it's about making sure it's feasible and affordable for everyone. So, what do you think about all this? Do you think car manufacturers want to be making EVs? Let me know down in the comments below. I just uploaded a video about groundbreaking news that could hurt the entire EV industry. Do check it out if you want to be truly shocked by what's about to happen with EVs.